Here is where things stood by early March of 2025. U.S. tariffs on Canada and Mexico took effect, and Canadian retaliatory tariffs began simultaneously. That tit-for-tat dynamic became the operating pattern for the entire conflict. A U.S. move, followed by a matching or partial Canadian countermove, followed by negotiation, followed by another U.S. move. Over the following months, tariffs piled up sector by sector. Steel and aluminum imports into the United States from Canada were hit with 25% tariffs. Canada responded in kind, placing 25% retaliatory tariffs on a wide basket of American steel, aluminum, and miscellaneous goods, a package worth close to 30 billion Canadian dollars, according to a detailed timeline compiled by the law firm Blake's, which has been tracking every order in council and executive order in this dispute since it started. Autos got their own 25% tariff regime with carve-outs for vehicles compliant with the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement known as CUSMA, the successor to NAFTA. Softwood lumber, one of Canada's oldest trade irritants with Washington going back decades, was hit with a 10% tariff. And on top of all of that, the U.S. added a 12.5% tariff tied to forced labor concerns, layering yet another cost onto Canadian exporters already absorbing multiple overlapping duties. By the summer of 2025, Carney was trying a different approach, conciliation paired with targeted domestic support. In August of that year, while announcing a $1.2 billion aid package for Canada's softwood lumber industry in British Columbia, Carney signaled he was open to removing some of Canada's own tariffs, if doing so would help Canadian industries hurt by the trade war, according to CBC News reporting from that period. He was not talking tough, he was talking pragmatic. That approach culminated later that month. Starting August 22nd, 2025, Canada removed the majority of its retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods that complied with CUSMA rules. It was, in effect, a partial unilateral de-escalation. Ottawa, betting that removing friction on compliant trade would build goodwill and momentum toward a comprehensive deal, even while non-compliant goods kept facing steep American tariffs. But goodwill did not translate into resolution. On August 1st, 2025, after the two countries failed to reach a deal by an earlier deadline, the U.S. imposed a 35% tariff on Canadian goods not covered by CUSMA. That rate has remained a persistent drag on cross-border trade in things like certain consumer products and industrial goods that fall outside the free trade agreement's protections. Meanwhile, throughout the fall and winter of 2025, tariff threats kept resurfacing. In December 2025, Trump warned he could place what he called very severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer. Around the same time, Carney, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, and Trump held trade meetings in Washington, with Trump telling reporters, "We'll work it out," even as uncertainty continued to weigh on business investment across Canada. Deloitte, in a report cited by Global News in January 2026, projected Canada's economic growth would slow to just 1.5% in 2026, a figure directly tied to the drag of sustained trade uncertainty. There is another piece of the 2025 timeline worth understanding, because it shows just how far this trade war has reached beyond simple tariffs into the mechanics of everyday cross-border commerce. On August 29, 2025, the United States suspended duty-free de minimis treatment for shipments from all countries, according to the timeline compiled by Blake's. That exemption had long allowed shipments valued at $800 or less to enter the country without duty, a rule that underpinned a huge volume of small parcel shipping from Canadian online retailers sending goods to American customers to cross-border e-commerce more broadly. Ending it added friction to thousands of small transactions a day, a change that rarely makes headlines the way a 50% tariff does, but one that Canadian small businesses and logistics companies have had to absorb quietly ever since. It is a reminder that this trade war has never been confined to steel mills and auto plants. It runs through nearly every channel connecting the two economies, down to the smallest parcel crossing the border. The dairy dispute, which keeps resurfacing in these negotiations, deserves its own bit of context, because it is older than this trade war and touches a political nerve in Canada that goes back generations. Canada's supply management system for dairy, eggs, and poultry sets production quotas and import tariffs designed to stabilize prices for Canadian farmers, largely concentrated in Quebec and Ontario. American dairy producers have complained for decades that the system locks them out of the Canadian market, and U.S. trade negotiators, under multiple administrations, not just Trump's, have repeatedly pushed Canada to open it further. Canada made modest concessions on dairy access as part of the original CUSMA agreement, but Washington has continued to argue Canada isn't honoring the spirit of those commitments, particularly around how import quotas are allocated to Canadian versus foreign processors. For Carney, dairy is less an economic question than a political one. touching supply management too aggressively risks a backlash in rural Quebec and Ontario ridings that could cost the Liberals seats in exactly the regions where the trade war is already causing the most economic pain. Autos carry a similarly deep history. The integration between the Canadian and American auto industries dates back to the 1965 Auto Pact, decades before NAFTA or CUSMA existed, and it created a supply chain where parts and partially finished vehicles can cross the Canada-U.S. border multiple times during production. A single engine block might be cast in Ontario, machined in Michigan, and installed in a vehicle assembled back in Ontario before the finished car is shipped to a dealership in either country. That is precisely why Carney has called autos very much at the core of the current talks. Tariffs on that sector don't just tax finished vehicles, they tax the same components multiple times as they cross the border during assembly, compounding costs in a way that a simple steel or lumber tariff does not. That brings us to this summer. And to the moment the title of this story refers to, the one where Washington appears to have miscalculated just how firm Ottawa's next move would be. In early August 2026, the White House escalated again. This time, the threat was a 50% tariff. Not on all Canadian exports, but on a targeted slice worth an estimated 28 billion Canadian dollars, or roughly 19.8 billion US dollars, according to an estimate from Desjardins reported by Yahoo Finance and The Hill. That is about 5% of everything Canada ships to the United States annually. The list of targeted goods, according to CBC News, ranges from alcohol to hockey sticks to cement, an eclectic mix that suggests this tariff was designed less around economic logic and more around applying maximum political pressure on specific Canadian regions and industries ahead of a hard deadline. Trump invoked Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, an old, rarely used statute, to authorize the move. The deadline for it to take effect, August 19, 2026. Carney's response to that threat is where this story turns from background into breaking development, and where Washington's assumptions about Ottawa's next move appear to have been wrong. Rather than quietly absorbing the threat or rushing to concede, Carney called a First Ministers meeting, a face-to-face gathering of all 13 provincial and territorial premiers, in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, in the first week of August. The choice of location was not incidental. Charlottetown is where the Fathers of Confederation gathered in 1864 to begin building the country now facing this fight. And Carney, according to CBC News coverage of the summit, invoked that history directly, framing the moment as a test of Canadian unity in the way the country's founding once was. At that meeting, Carney delivered the line that has since defined this phase of the standoff. If these tariffs or other measures come into force, there's a full range of things that we can do. He added that retaliating immediately, before the deadline actually passed, would be counterproductive while negotiations continued. A calculated restraint, not passivity. He went further, suggesting the deadline itself might be more about negotiating leverage than a fixed outcome. Normally there's a deadline, Carney said. Normally there's an outsized tariff associated with that deadline. In other words, Carney was reading Washington's move not as an ultimatum carved in stone, but as a pressure tactic, one Canada should not panic in response to, but should instead use as an opening to extract concessions of its own. That reframing is, in many ways, the change the trade fight moment referenced in the title of this story. For most of the past 18 months, Canada's posture had cycled between retaliation and conciliation, often reacting to whatever Washington did most recently. In Charlottetown, Carney signaled a shift. Canada would hold its retaliatory options in reserve, refuse to be rushed by the deadline, and instead use the threat of a coordinated, unified provincial response, a Team Canada approach, as its own form of leverage. It denies Washington the reaction it may have expected, and it forces the negotiation to continue on terms Ottawa has more control over. That unity, though, has visible cracks, and any honest account of this story has to include them. The premiers are not aligned on tactics. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has pushed for the most aggressive stance among them, urging Canada to be on offense and to keep everything on the table, including a possible surcharge on electricity exports to the United States, a lever Ontario controls directly given its role supplying power to parts of the American Midwest and Northeast. Ford has also previously floated the idea of withholding Canadian potash and oil as a way to, in his words, dismantle the United States' access to critical Canadian resources. British Columbia Premier David Eby has taken an equally hard line rhetorically, according to CBC News, framing the stakes in blunt terms. Alberta tells a different story. Premier Danielle Smith has said she does not believe in retaliatory tariffs, particularly when it comes to oil, a position rooted in Alberta's outsized economic dependence on energy exports to the U.S. and its long-standing skepticism of federal trade strategy that it sees as sometimes prioritizing central Canadian industries like autos and dairy over Western resource exports. Smith did strike a more constructive note ahead of the Charlottetown meeting. describing the coming weeks as a window. 28 days, she said at the time, to sharpen the pencils and sharpen the focus on resolving outstanding tariffs across autos, steel, aluminum, and softwood lumber. In Quebec, the politics are narrower but no less real. Premier Christine Frechette is focused on securing reduced tariffs on aluminum, a critical Quebec export, without giving up ground on dairy market access, a notoriously sensitive file in Canadian trade politics because of the country's supply management system, which Washington has repeatedly targeted as a barrier to American dairy exports. A spokesperson for Frechette told Bloomberg that, in the context of the ongoing trade war, the Premier continues to defend Quebec's economic interests, a carefully neutral statement that nonetheless signals Quebec will not simply defer to a federal deal that trades away its priorities. Goldie Hyder, president and CEO of the Business Council of Canada, offered perhaps the sharpest outside assessment of Carney's position, telling Bloomberg that the situation underscores the difficulty of governing our country as a federation. Hyder's organization has been actively pushing Carney to close a deal with Trump, reflecting business community anxiety that prolonged uncertainty is doing as much damage as the tariffs themselves, chilling investment decisions, delaying capital spending, and pushing some manufacturers to consider shifting production south of the border rather than wait out the dispute. Hyder said the Prime Minister has to carve out a place for doing what's right for the country above all else. A diplomatic way of saying that Carney may eventually need to make an unpopular call, one that will not satisfy every premier or every industry simultaneously. Public opinion adds another layer of pressure. An Angus Reid Institute survey found that 62% of Canadians want Carney to hit the United States with retaliatory tariffs if Trump follows through on the 50% threat. That number matters politically. Carney's Liberal government does not have the luxury of appearing weak on this file, particularly after 18 months of a trade war that has become one of the defining issues of his time in office. At the same time, a majority favoring retaliation poll does not tell Carney what to retaliate against, how hard, or for how long, and overly aggressive countermeasures risk provoking exactly the kind of escalatory spiral that could push both economies toward recession, a risk Carney himself has explicitly warned about in prior remarks, according to reporting from earlier in 2026, when he said Trump's escalating tariffs risked triggering a global downturn. The temperature of these talks has not been calm. On August 7, 2026, Carney told reporters, speaking partly in French, that negotiations with the United States had turned nasty. This followed comments Trump made during a speech in Las Vegas, where he derided Canada and its leadership directly, saying, "Canada's nasty." They are. They're nasty, according to the Associated Press. Trump has also repeatedly floated the idea that Canada should become the 51st American state, a suggestion that Canadian officials and much of the Canadian public have treated as both absurd and genuinely provocative, prompting, among other things, a wave of Canadians canceling planned trips to the United States as a form of quiet, consumer-level protest. Carney, responding to the nasty framing, did not back away from the characterization. "This is a tough negotiation," he said. "You can say nasty, but this is a question of Canadian jobs. It's a question of the future of Canadian businesses." That framing, jobs and businesses over rhetoric, has become Carney's consistent public posture. Acknowledge the hostility of the exchange without escalating the language himself, and keep steering the conversation back toward concrete economic stakes for Canadian workers. Despite the friction, negotiators have not walked away from the table. As of August 13, 2026, just 6 days before the deadline, Bloomberg reported that Canadian trade officials remained in Washington, working through a proposed set of terms that would reduce some existing tariffs and retaliatory measures on both sides. Central to those talks is a revived idea from earlier negotiating rounds: a system of quotas on Canadian steel and aluminum exports to the United States, offered in exchange for Trump lowering the 50% Section 232 tariffs currently applied to those metals under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. The logic is straightforward. Canada would accept a capped volume of exports in those sectors, giving Washington a form of managed trade it has sought in exchange for real relief on the tariff rate itself. But, as of this reporting, disputes over autos, steel, aluminum, lumber, and dairy access all remain unresolved, and any final agreement requires President Trump's personal approval, a fact that introduces significant uncertainty even if Canadian and American negotiators reach technical consensus at the working level. Carney has been explicit about what a resolution needs to include. Canada has been very clear. "We want all 232s addressed, all strategic sectors," he said, referring to Section 232 tariffs by their shorthand name in Ottawa's negotiating circles. Steel, aluminum, autos, forest products. He added that autos are very much at the core of the discussions. According to an industry source cited by the Globe and Mail, the United States has so far only made broad, unspecific demands on the auto sector. a pattern some in the negotiating circle interpret as a deliberate stalling tactic. The theory: because auto tariffs are such an acute pain point for Canada's economy, the sector is deeply integrated across the Canada-U.S. border, with parts and partially assembled vehicles crossing multiple times before a finished car rolls off the line. The Trump administration may be holding that specific issue back, using it as leverage to extract maximum concessions from Ottawa on everything else before finally addressing autos last. It's worth pausing here to be clear about what has not happened, because a story like this can easily blur into asserting outcomes that remain, as of today, unresolved. The 50% tariff has not yet taken effect. No comprehensive deal has been signed. Carney has not announced specific retaliatory measures in response to the current threat. His public position remains that Canada is prepared to act if the deadline passes without an agreement, not that it has already acted. The claim in the title, that Carney has changed the trade fight, refers to a shift in posture and strategy, refusing to be rushed, keeping a coordinated provincial front, and reframing the deadline as a negotiating tactic rather than an immovable deadline to panic over. It does not refer to a finalized outcome because there isn't one yet. Zoom out, and this dispute sits inside a much larger picture of how Trump's second-term trade strategy has operated globally, not just with Canada. The administration has used tariff deadlines, Section 232 national security justifications, and periodic escalate then negotiate cycles as a consistent playbook, visible in disputes with multiple trading partners over the past year and a half. Canada is a particularly high-stakes test case because of how deeply integrated the two economies are. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium to the United States, according to reporting from the Associated Press. That is not a minor trading relationship. It is a load-bearing pillar of American industrial supply chains, which is part of why so many U.S. industries, from automakers to construction firms, have quietly lobbied against sustained tariffs on Canadian metals, even as the political rhetoric around the trade war has escalated. There is also a domestic Canadian politics layer that shapes everything Carney does. His Liberal government came to power in the shadow of Trudeau's departure, and an early election shaped almost entirely by the trade war and by Trump's rhetoric toward Canada. Carney built his early political identity around the idea that he, as a former central banker who had navigated two G7 economies through financial crises, was uniquely positioned to manage exactly this kind of high-stakes economic confrontation. That reputation is now being tested in real time in Ottawa, under a deadline he does not fully control. If he strikes a deal seen as too soft, opposition figures, including Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, who has previously criticized the Liberals for what he characterized as inconsistent messaging around tariffs, at one point mocking a elbows up, elbows down framing used by Carney's own government, will attack him as having capitulated. If talks collapse and the 50% tariff takes effect, Carney faces pressure from premiers like Ford and from the 62% of Canadians who, per Angus Reid, want a forceful response, to retaliate hard and fast, even at the risk of accelerating economic damage on both sides of the border. The broader economic backdrop makes the stakes of this negotiation even clearer. Deloitte's January 2026 forecast, cited by Global News, projected Canada's economic growth would slow to just 1.5% for the year, a figure economists directly tied to sustained trade uncertainty rather than any single tariff. At the same time, other economic indicators told a more complicated story. Global News also reported a sharp drop in Canadian unemployment around the same period, suggesting the labor market has, so far, absorbed the trade shock better than some early forecasts predicted, even as investment decisions remain clouded by uncertainty over where this dispute lands. That mixed picture, resilient employment alongside slowing growth and stalled investment, is part of why business groups like Hyder's Business Council of Canada are pushing so hard for finality in either direction, rather than the extended limbo the two countries have been living in since February 2025. Energy policy has also become entangled in the broader standoff, even though oil itself has largely avoided direct tariff action so far. Alberta has floated pipeline expansion as a way to reduce Canada's economic dependence on the U.S. market by opening new export routes to Asia and Europe, a longer-term hedge against exactly this kind of trade confrontation. Ontario's Doug Ford has specifically raised the idea of surcharging electricity exports to the United States as a retaliatory tool, a lever that would hit American states in the Midwest and Northeast that rely on Canadian power imports, particularly during peak demand periods. None of these energy-related measures have been implemented as retaliation in the current dispute, but they remain part of the toolkit provincial leaders have publicly discussed as options if the 50% tariff takes effect on August 19th. Domestic politics adds pressure from another direction entirely. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has criticized the Liberal government's messaging throughout the trade war, at one point mocking what he characterized as an inconsistent elbows up, elbows down approach. a reference to the hockey metaphor Carney's government has used to describe Canada's posture toward the U. S implying toughness one week and conciliation the next. That criticism captures the core political bind Carney is in. Any visible softening in the negotiating position risks being framed by the opposition as weakness, while any hard retaliatory move risks being blamed for whatever economic pain follows. Carney has tried to navigate this by keeping his public language measured, describing talks as nasty without escalating his own rhetoric, and describing Canada's response options as a full range without committing to specifics before they're needed. The economic exposure varies sharply by province, and understanding that variation helps explain why the premiers disagree so visibly on strategy. Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia face the greatest direct exposure to the specific 50% tariff threat, according to the Desjardins analysis reported by Yahoo Finance. That is a significant part of why Ford has pushed the hardest for aggressive countermeasures. Ontario's manufacturing and auto sectors sit directly in the blast radius. Alberta's exposure runs through a different channel, energy. Its economy depends heavily on oil exports to the United States, a trade flow that has so far avoided the most severe tariff escalations, which helps explain Smith's reluctance to endorse retaliatory tariffs that could invite Washington to target Alberta's oil sector in response. Quebec's aluminum and dairy sectors sit in yet another category, tied to both the Section 232 metals dispute and the older chronic friction over Canada's supply-managed agricultural system. What happens between now and August 19th will likely fall into one of a few outcomes based on everything currently on the record. Negotiators could reach a deal, potentially built around the steel and aluminum quota framework reported by the Globe and Mail, that averts the 50% tariff and rolls back some existing measures on both sides, though even that outcome would leave autos and dairy as unfinished business requiring further rounds of talks. Alternatively, talks could stall on one of the harder files, autos in particular, given the broad demands characterization from the industry source, pushing the deadline to pass without full resolution and triggering the 50% tariff on the targeted list of goods. In that scenario, Carney has signaled Canada would respond, though he has not specified precisely what that response would look like. And the record is clear that Ottawa has moved away from immediate mirror image retaliation as its default instinct over the past year, preferring calibrated sector-specific responses instead. A third possibility, consistent with the pattern seen repeatedly since February 2025, is a partial or temporary extension, a short-term reprieve that pushes the hardest decisions further down the calendar without resolving them, buying both sides time but extending the uncertainty that business leaders like Hyder say is already imposing its own economic cost, separate from the tariffs themselves. It's worth remembering, too, that this is not the first time the two countries have set a 30-day clock on resolving these disputes, only to blow past it. Back in June 2025, after Carney met Trump at the G7 Leaders Summit hosted in Kananaskis, Alberta, the two sides announced they had agreed to pursue negotiations toward a comprehensive trade deal within 30 days, according to the Associated Press. Carney said at the time that Canada would review its response to steel and aluminum tariffs as those talks progressed, and warned that Trump's escalating tariffs, 50% on metals, 25% on autos at that point, risked triggering a global recession. That 30-day window came and went without a comprehensive deal. Instead, it produced incremental moves, partial tariff removals, a temporary deadline extension from July 9th to August 1st, and eventually the 35% tariff that took effect that August after talks still hadn't concluded. The pattern is clear across 18 months of this dispute. Deadlines get set, deadlines get partially missed, and negotiations continue anyway, often past the point where the original tariff threat has already taken effect. That history is exactly why Carney's comment that normally there's an outsized tariff associated with that deadline carries real weight. He has been through this specific cycle before, more than once, and his current strategy in Ottawa reflects lessons learned from watching those earlier deadlines pass without a full resolution. Whether Trump will personally approve any deal Canadian and American negotiators land on remains an open question, given his demonstrated pattern of overriding or renegotiating agreements reached by his own trade officials in other contexts, and the specific shape of any Canadian retaliation, should talks fail, has been described only in general terms by Carney. A full range of things that we can do, without confirmed specifics on tariff rates, target sectors, or timing. Anyone telling you with certainty exactly what Canada will do if the deadline passes without a deal is speculating beyond what has actually been confirmed by Ottawa as of this recording. The sources behind this account include on-the-record statements from Prime Minister Mark Carney at the Charlotte Town First Ministers meeting, and in subsequent press conferences, reporting from CBC News and Radio Canada on those events, Bloomberg's August 13th reporting on the state of negotiations in Washington, the Associated Press's coverage of Carney's nasty comments and Trump's Las Vegas remarks, The Hill and Yahoo Finance's reporting on the 50% tariff threat, and the Desjardins Economic Impact Estimate, the Globe and Mail's reporting on the revived steel and aluminum quota proposal, and the timeline of tariff orders and executive actions compiled by the law firm Blake's. The Angus Reid Institute survey provides the public opinion data cited here. Where this account describes ongoing negotiations, unresolved sectors, or Carney's stated but unspecified retaliatory options, that reflects the genuine, currently unresolved state of talks as reported, not a confirmed outcome. So where does that leave things, with the deadline now just days away? Ottawa has spent 18 months learning how to negotiate with an administration that treats deadlines as leverage rather than fixed law, and Carney's approach in Charlottetown, refusing to panic, refusing to retaliate prematurely, and trying to hold a fractured federation together behind a single negotiating position, represents a genuine shift in how Canada has played this fight compared to earlier phases of the conflict. Whether that shift produces a deal that protects Canadian steelworkers in Hamilton, aluminum smelters in Quebec, auto plants in Ontario, and lumber mills in British Columbia, or whether it collapses into another round of tariffs and counter-tariffs come August 19th, is still an open question that even the people inside the negotiating room in Washington may not fully know the answer to yet. What do you think Canada's next move should be if the deadline passes without a deal? Hold the line and wait Washington out? Or hit back immediately the way Doug Ford and a majority of Canadians polled seem to want? Let us know where you land on it. Thanks for watching.